All right. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome everybody to a very special Sunday session with the Usuli Institute. It's our program on spiritual and sexual abuse, dispelling myths from an Islamic perspective, Q&A with Sheikh Khaled Abou El Fadl. Once again, we are live streaming this simultaneously on YouTube. On YouTube, it appears that, if your camera is live, you actually will be part of the recording. So if you don't want to appear, then please go ahead and turn off your camera because after we finish, it will go on YouTube for people to watch after the fact. So I wanted to welcome everyone. My name is Grace Song. I'm the executive director of the Usuli Institute. Before we begin the official program, we actually have a very special guest performance to kick us off. We are so honored and blessed to have with us the brilliantly talented, accomplished, and powerhouse spoken word poet, Sophia Baig. She has traveled around the world and shared her inspiring words in secular spaces, in Muslim spaces, and even on CNN. And we are so honored to have her demonstrate what it means to be a strong Muslim woman to be reckoned with. She is here to perform a piece in the spirit and the purpose of our gathering. So with that, I turn it over to Sophia.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Sophia Baig, and the poem I'm going to be reciting today is called Can I Breathe? This poem was written and it's dedicated to a very dear friend of mine who I recently lost a couple of years ago. So this poem is called Can I Breathe? I choke on these words with no period, end of sentence. This lifelong sentence, imprisoned since the first day of birth, and this breath has been taken, put a price on my worth. This earth spinning so fast, and I am growing up too fast. See, I'm an empty shell behind this made up and manufactured mask, programmed to not knowing who I am. And see, who I am has become what am I? As you grow older, you begin to realize that we've been sitting wide-eyed on the laps of men as they dictate definitions of different types of women, dehumanize and depersonalize, categorize you to fit into their lives. But it's two-sided. Why? Because we conform to their lies, masquerading as if it's all fine. And see, I choke on these words with no period, end of sentence. My present disorder, my emotions wrapped up, tied up with a bow like a present, see, packaged by the hands of others and ripped open by the hands of others. See, my present disorder, there is no why in my life, there is no I in my life, but a why, question mark, my life, question, who am I? And see, who I am has become what am I? As you grow older, you begin to realize how infantile the minds of grown individuals can be. See, it's not love, but ignorance of it that we're getting in reciprocity. See, giving the world a lap dance just to get their illusionary jewelry. See, temporary pleasures in exchange for the treasure of innocence. And why is it that my truth is received by resentment? And see, I choke on these words with no period, end of sentence. This world void of repentance where my sins define me and my truth hides from me, disguised by empty bliss caused by the obscurity of idolatry. See, hidden between who I am and who I ought to be. And who I am has become what am I? My validation does not reside in the hands of men, the ones who animalize a relationship based on sexual aggression. See, the deceptions of men that manipulate a situation to have you conform to their sexual frustration, then distort holy scriptures for self-defense. My validation does not reside in the hands of those who keep me from the truth, the ones who see profit in my youth, the ones who see my weakness as their tribute. My validation does not reside in the hands of those who take my God-given beauty, the ones who exploit it until they find another definition for what's ugly. See, the ones who take away the mirrors and give you an image of who you should be. And see, I choke on these words with no period, end of sentence. This lifelong sentence of who I am and who I ought to be. See, there is no what to my being. Rather, I am who I choose to be. And see, now can I breathe as God made me? Thank you, everyone.
Alhamdulillah, thank you. That was amazing. Sorry, it brought me to tears. It was really beautiful. Thank you so much. If you are just joining us, we just heard a brilliant piece by the accomplished spoken word poet Sophia Begg. This is her bio. Sophia Begg is a Columbus, Ohio-based multidisciplinary artist and designer. Originally from Montreal, Sophia is a proud daughter of Pakistani and Filipina immigrants. As a Muslim woman of mixed heritage, her work is an exploration of her third culture identity and an attempt at making sense of the world around her. Her background not only inspires her work, but is a constant reminder of the importance of intersectional advocacy and the interconnectedness of the human experience. It's absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much for honoring and blessing this event with your poem. It was outstanding. So this is really just the perfect way to kick off a very special conversation on an incredibly important topic. If you are new to the Usuli Institute, we are a 501c3 nonprofit education institute, and our mission is to elevate ethics, critical thinking, and dignity through education, particularly in the Islamic intellectual tradition. We are currently engaged in an intensive immersion into the understanding of the moral message of the Quran. So we have been doing deep dives into every single chapter of the Quran to understand the moral and ethical message of each surah, identifying the moral trajectory of our faith and applying the moral principles, the timeless moral principles to our current moment. We believe that Islam and the Quran call for a vibrant engagement with our world through the lens of ethics and justice, and that we need to be at the forefront of truth, transparency, mercy, and justice. And that brings us to our very important topic today. But first, let me introduce you to Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl. For those of you who might not be aware, Dr. Abou El Fadl is a distinguished professor of law at the UCLA School of Law, where he teaches a number of courses, including Islamic jurisprudence, Muslims, race and law, political asylum, human trafficking, public international law, and many others. He is an expert in the field of human rights and was awarded the University of Oslo Human Rights Award in 2007. He just received the American Academy of Religion's most prestigious Martin E. Marty Award for the public understanding of religion in 2020. He is also a classically trained Islamic jurist, having trained under numerous sheikhs in Egypt and Kuwait, and perhaps most notable among them, Sheikh Mohammed Al-Ghazali. And he is the founder of the Usuli Institute, and in full disclosure, he's also my husband, or I'm his wife. I have the blessing of being his wife. Importantly, for our program today, Dr. Abou El Fadl has dedicated his life to the pursuit of justice through teaching, legal work, expert testimony, and even acting as the chair of the Student Conduct Committee at UCLA for about a decade, where he adjudicated cases of rape, sexual abuse, and sexual harassment. Notably, he closed down a fraternity on campus from repeated offenses involving the drugging and raping of UCLA co-eds. He has also a long scholarly record of defending women's rights and the rights of the disempowered. Also, he, as a regular spiritual guide, many Muslims have turned to him for advice on issues of abuse and the issues that we will be addressing today. And currently, he is sharing his lifetime engagement with the Quran through our project Illumine the Light of the Quran Halakas. He also delivers weekly virtual Friday khutbahs at the Usuli Institute, in which week after week he is focusing on the most pressing issues confronting our community. And notably recently, he dedicated 2 khutbahs to the issue of sexual and spiritual abuse in our community. I'm really proud that at the Usuli Institute, we tackle difficult issues, controversial topics, and human issues that other Muslim spaces often will not touch. I'm particularly excited for today's discussion, which I expect will be open and honest and transparent and hopefully extremely valuable for those who are watching, inshallah. To provide a little bit of background about our gathering, It's become clear through connecting with the many Muslims who have contacted us, as well as through our own research, that sexual and spiritual abuse have become pervasive in our communities. However, because of the taboo nature, stigma, and confusion around these topics, there's often silence, or worse, injustice when it comes to how to handle situations appropriately, how to help victims of abuse, and how to deal with those accused of being perpetrators of abuse. And all of us know, or have experience with someone who has been affected by sexual or spiritual abuse. So we are hoping that today's session will allow us to touch upon some of these most confusing areas and address questions that many of us have from an Islamic perspective. So we know that 2 hours with the Sheikh is going to pass very quickly. So I wanted to just in transparency, let you know that we have a program that we have organized so that we hopefully can touch some of the most important questions before us in this time frame. Because this is a sensitive topic and some people might not feel comfortable asking certain questions, what we did is we generated a list of our top questions and we recruited volunteers to ask those questions of the Sheikh. And our hope is that this way, we can work through those questions and inshallah have some time at the end to also take some questions from the audience. If you have any questions along the way, please feel free to send them to the chat to Ramin. Ramin will be collecting those questions and we will try to get through as many as we can. And if for some reason we can't get through them and we have a good critical mass, and we will do our best to do a part 2, inshallah, sometime in the future. So with that, let's begin. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much for joining us, and I pray that Allah will bless this conversation, help us learn what we need to learn, and discuss what we need to learn. So I wanted to start by asking the Sheikh if we could start by talking about, what exactly is spiritual abuse and sexual abuse. I know a lot of websites that address these issues take time to define those terms. And I wanted to see if, especially in relation to religious authority, if you could perhaps say a few words about those terms.
Okay, well, I don't think that at the outset, the point is not to provide an intellectually rigorous definition. For our purposes, I think it is sufficient that we identify what are main characteristics of what we normally would identify as abuse. Spiritual abuse, of course, is more elusive than sexual abuse, but in essence, both sexual and spiritual involve a power dynamic, and that is always at the heart of the matter. And it always involves a level of deference, so that the abusive party is demanding a certain amount of deference from the victim, but that deference rises to the level of exploitation, because in all authoritative relationships, there is always a process of deference. You trust someone's knowledge, you trust someone's access to information, you trust someone's judgment, and so you defer to them. You say, I rely on you for my decision-making process. But in abusive relationships, that deference rises to the level of exploitation. And there is always the abusive party is very much like what we heard from the poem, treats the other as a vehicle for their own self-fulfillment. they have a craving, they have a desire, they have a longing, they have a set of interests that are often not clearly disclosed. So there's lack of transparency. There's always an element of dishonesty. There's always an element of breach of trust, and the deference is corrupted, because normally the reason you give someone deference is because you want to please God, or you want to promote your own knowledge, or you want to grow spiritually. But in abusive relationship, there's a breach of trust, and the abused attains a level of deceitful self-fulfillment at the expense of the abused. So these are basically the elements we always see. I mean, repeatedly, what we always see. And sometimes it takes the abused a while before they realize that there's dishonesty in the relationship, before they realize that, in fact, this is not about the goals that they thought they were serving, that this is not about the objectives that they believed were being promoted, and that, in fact, the person who's exploiting them has turned a dynamic that is supposed to have loftier goals into something that simply is entirely self-serving. And so these are the typical characteristics, aside from an intellectually rigorous academic definition of what abusive relationships are.
When we talk about the difference between spiritual abuse and sexual abuse, I know that from reading some examples online in preparation for this, it seems that things can slide from one into another quite imperceptibly, maybe, or shockingly for the one that is being abused. There was an example that I read of a sheikh who, the girl thought, can I kiss your hand? And then he said yes, and she kissed his hand, and then it turned to him kissing her on the cheek, and then more from that. Is that, I don't know if there's any.
I mean, there is what amounts to a thinly veiled act of sexual aggression. And so the spiritual abuse basically is, or the spiritual element is exploited to attain proximity or closeness or access to the victim. But then it becomes very quickly apparent that we've now evolved into outright sexual aggression, and assault, effectively. So, in the example that you're mentioning, the victim, for a short period of time, thinks that, well, maybe kissing hands has something to do with spiritual presence. But the victim very quickly realizes that now we've moved on to an actual sexual assault. The other type, which plagues our community, both plague our community, obviously, but the one that is even more insidious and that plagues our community at many different levels is where you exploit your access to religious knowledge or a religious aura, if we can put it this way, in order to convince the victim to consent to a situation that is exploitative. and that type of situation, normally it takes years before the victim realizes I've been exploited. And then the elements of shame and pain and emotional damage are at a very different level, because the victim always thinks of all the different ways that they were an active participant in their own in their own humiliation, and in retrospect, the victim wonders, how did I allow myself to end up in so many not so dignified situations, and that the whole process of the abuser grooming the victim and convincing the victim that there is no exploitation, because we are, somehow this relationship is serving God or blessed by God, or desired by God in some way, that this is what God wants. And unfortunately, that this situation, often the abuser is exploiting the lack of religious knowledge on part of the victim, and these are extremely painful, and they're a reality that we see in our community all the time.
Maybe we can talk a little bit too in terms of defining, because there, clearly there's an issue when someone is groomed, when they're touched physically. But I know there are also examples of people who were asked for pictures of themselves, and so there isn't any necessarily physical, contact, but nevertheless there is, either like an ask for an exchange of, a body part, or, something that is used, could be expressed is used in a legitimate reason, but it, might come out that it actually isn't legitimate.
I mean, I'm just trying to think. So are you referring to a situation like, for instance, someone would fraudulently say, I need a picture of X body part because of a scientific project? Why? I mean, because of
Right.
Scientific research?
I'm comparing hands and I need a picture of your hand,
Well, I mean, listen, the heart of the thing, though, and we perhaps because culturally we have come to minimize the minimize the moral wrong of dishonesty. A lie is a lie is a lie, and when you are, it's fraudulent, and so already we have a base wrong right there, that someone is lying. Now, this, quite frankly, I mean, the religious element is even absent, because you're saying, I'm doing scientific research, in quotes, right? So help me out in my scientific research. And my response is, if file a criminal complaint about a person who lies to you, and if it smells bad, if it feels bad, don't engage in it. I mean, there are legitimate ways in which you are asked to be a part of a scientific experiment. And check with any psychology department in any university. There are very well-defined ways by which a subject gives their consent to be a part of a scientific experiment. Nothing legitimate is done on the fly like that. Nothing legitimate is done through, without any consent forms, without any proper procedural steps. Just help me out in some ill-defined research. And that's just simple fraud. I mean, that's not even using the divine will, exploiting the divine will in some way. That's just outright lying, fraudulent behavior. And we often in the Muslim community, we have a very flawed premise. And the flawed premise is that because this is a Muslim brother or sister, and yes, religiously, we are commanded to think of our co-religionists as a Muslim brother and sister. But remember what the Quran says, that teaches us to uphold justice, to testify to the truth, even if it is against a brother, a mother, a father, a son, a daughter, or even against ourselves. And so the fact that a brother or sister defrauded me or lied to me is in no way a mitigation of the offense. It is, in fact, an element of aggravation. I am duty bound. Maybe I'm not duty bound to expose a non-brother or non-sister that defrauds me. But Islamically, if a brother or sister defraud me, I am duty bound to expose them. You have, it's a different change. It's a change in perspective. You are under a moral obligation to clean your own house. And in order to clean your own house, you need to be vigilant about your internal dynamics, which often means that while I could feel free to forgive and forget when a non-Muslim is involved, and this I'm talking about my own life if I have someone who comes to me and poses themselves as someone who shares the normative commitments of Islam, and I see that they are exploiting these normative commitments, I actually feel a moral obligation to expose them that I might not feel when a non-Muslim is involved. I have a moral obligation to clean house. And I know it's a very different way of typically how Muslims deal with each other, but especially when it comes, because there are elements that we'll talk about in our own tradition that will not be fixed, will not be improved unless we learn to be very honest about our own vulnerabilities. And I am talking about doctrinal vulnerabilities. There are elements within the Islamic tradition, doctrinally, that yield themselves to easy exploitation, especially misogynistic exploitation. And unless we adopt a moral attitude that we collectively all guard a clean house, and therefore take this ayah that tells us to testify even against our closest and our most loved, unless we take this very seriously, things will continue to get worse and worse.
So let me ask one last question, because I think it was really important that you said, in defining spiritual and sexual abuse, it's not about an intellectual definition, but a lot of it depends on this internal sense of, is there something happening here where someone is lying to me? Is there, a lack of truthfulness? And I think oftentimes we, on first impression, feel that something is wrong, and then we often will talk ourselves out of it. Or we will think, come up with reasons to think, well, maybe I'm being too judgmental. Maybe I'm being, I'm whatever. I'm not listening to my gut. But you're actually saying, it's important to, also take into account that sense of, okay, I'm not going to convince myself that this person is not lying, or that I'm not feeling uncertain for some reason. It's not sitting with me quite right. I think that's an important part of the toolkit of being able to protect ourselves, from being in these situations.
I mean, part of what I've alluded to about doctrinal problems, and again, I mean, I hope that we'll be able to flush this out as we go along. But okay, there are things in Islamic jurisprudence that you can communicate to. Just imagining a typical situation that you can communicate to a potential victim. By saying, well, this is a valid marriage contract. Here's what's required for a marriage contract. But look at what the Quran itself teaches us. Put aside the technicalities of law for a second. And what the Quran teaches us about the basic moral posture, right? So, in Surah An-Nisa, for instance, where it says, وآتوهن أجورهن بالمعروف محصنات غير مسافحات ولا متخذات أخدان. So the key elements here is محصنات غير مسافحات ولا متخذات أخدان, which means, to put it bluntly, and again in Surah Al-Ma'idah, right after An-Nisa, Surah Al-Ma'idah, we have a very similar language describing what Allah wants. غير مسافحات, so ولا متخذات أخدان, essentially, don't take secret lovers. Don't engage in the dark relationships. Don't engage in relationships that don't see the sun, right? And further, I believe if people have been following the tafsir we've been doing, there is another thing. Don't enter into relationships of istidaf. Don't enter into relationships of unequal power, where you have one party that is the know-it-all, the authority in all things, and is informing the other party, sort of acting as the medium for Allah's will. Here's what Allah wants from you. If we internalize this Quranic ethic within our soul, in other words, if we understand that Allah is saying, again, technicalities of law aside, because we can get into that, So if we're again in Surah Al-Ma'idah, I'm just محصنين غير مسافحين ولا متخذي أخذان, which is again very similar or very close language to Surah Al-Nisa. That now, so you know that a relationship that cannot be held out in public and that feels off is in all probability off and is in all probability inconsistent with the Quranic ethic, because although the Quran very clearly warned us against sifah and against akhdan, against relationships that don't see the sun, against relationships in which there is unequal power between the parties. Islamic law was largely written by men. And we have to be very honest and frank about this. And Islamic law was largely written by men through most, and to our age, but most human history, including Islamic history, is a patriarchal history. It's a history of patriarchy. Men are in control, and they are communicating all types of things, including what is good for society, what is good, what are the cultural norms, what are the social habits, what is the divine will to women, right? And so although Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us, don't engage in sifah, don't engage in akhdan, you will find that the law produced by Muslim men in so many of its technicalities fails the Quranic ideal. And that is precisely what a lot of imams exploit. They don't start with the Quran when they're on the project of taking advantage of someone. They will cite, technicalities like, al-ishar or publicity is not a condition for a valid marriage, which is technically true. Ishar is not a condition of a public marriage. They'll say, all that is required for a valid marriage is 2 witnesses, which is again technically true. And that some schools of thought even said you don't need witnesses. All that's needed is offer, acceptance, and dowry, which is again technically true. The difference here is between morality and law. Morality, divine morality, and the way that human beings processed that divine morality. And I would submit to you that quite often we are in a situation where the way that we interpretively process this divine morality, we did so in a deeply misogynistic way. And we can't sugarcoat it. Okay, we can't. If we are serious, first you have to believe that sexual exploitation and spiritual abuse actually offends God. Because if you don't believe it offends God, then khalas, we're done. There's no more we can talk about. But if you believe it really offends God, then we have to have a very honest discussion about what are the scenarios, what are the abuse scenarios, and how is Islamic law deployed in these abuse scenarios. I'm not impressed by theoretical abstract discussions, whether academic or non-academic, but what are the actual examples in which law is deployed in abuse scenarios? And if we are honest about this, we will find ourselves very quickly being very honest about the role of misogyny in the interpretive process that produced a lot of rules of jurisprudence. And then we can start moving forward. Then we can, it's very easy to play the pietistic game and say, here, I am a sheikh, and here's Allah's will in this book and that book, and all you have to do is open up the Umdat al-Qari by such and such jurist, or by Muwatta by Malik, and here are the rules. Yes, but ultimately, I believe that we are cheating God. God is not pleased when something that God created to be a vehicle for beauty, for an ihsan fil ard, which is marital relationships, becomes a vehicle for pain and agony. You have to share in that belief that offends Allah in order for us to move forward.
Alhamdulillah, this is just, again, another plug for the Project Illumine Halakas on the Quran, which is really focused on the elevation of morality over law. This is a constant theme that we are talking about, and so pertinent here. I wanted to turn it over to Sarah, who has the first question.
So Dr. Khaled, you've touched a little bit on my question, but I'm gonna still define it anyways. So I was wondering, in situations where a relationship is defined as consensual, and then given the power dynamics in that relationship and saying that there is a power imbalance in that relationship, can you kind of get into more detail of how that relationship can be abusive, can be exploitative? And then Islamically, if a person is clearly indicating their attraction, their interest, what are the responsibilities of the religious authority at hand?
Okay, so the first part, because, from a legal perspective, often free consent is a complete defense, meaning that from the point of view of law, the bottom line is quite often, have you given consent? Have you given your consent freely without what counts as coercion within law? And if the answer is yes, then that's the end of the inquiry, and we're done. But law is, in order to, there is always a challenge when we talk about law, and that is, law has to always think about to what extent it intervenes with human agency, because the more aggressive the law in trying to micro-regulate human behavior, the more the law could end up taking away human agency, human freedom. And the law is also challenged by things like what counts as evidential, as legally recognizable, legally cognizable evidence. So, if we talk about fraud, then immediately law starts thinking about what is the proof of fraud. But when we are talking about moral issues and ethical issues, we are often talking about the reality of things that even if institutionally and procedurally law is unable to deal with this reality for a variety of reasons. And the reality of things is that consent is a very tricky thing, right? Because what counts as coercion or in law is a very limited range of circumstance. But in real life, people give their consent for all types of reasons that problematize the very concept of freedom. I mean, so let's take the most typical example. An imam that puts on the garb of piety and talks to often an inexperienced woman, normally a woman that has not had a lot of experiences with men, and convinces her that Allah desires them to be together, or that being with him will allow her to flourish spiritually. Marry me so I can teach you how to be a good Muslim, sort of, effectively. Or marry me because wouldn't necessarily put it in these blatant words, but I am a blessed man, and if you are with me, you will grow in blessings, right? We as a community have to be honest in saying, if you are a religious teacher, we do this even in let's say in the academia. Benefiting from your relationship to your student sexually is highly, highly suspect category. And that even if legally this counts as giving consent, morally it's unacceptable. And that is often, often the presentation of the will of God involves an element of fraud and deception on behalf of the imam as they're talking to the victim, because they will not tell that person what musafihat, غير musafihat, غير متخذات أخدان mean. They will not talk about the Quranic moral outlook that secret relationships, undisclosed relationships are highly suspect. They will not talk about the fact that in all likelihood, there's nothing blessed about it. If they're actually being really honest, they'll say, I eat and go to the bathroom like any other human being, and I struggle with my spirituality like any other human being. And in fact, I'm just a human being like any other human being. And this aura of pietistic affectations that induces an inexperienced human being to engage in this relationship is morally offensive. And we must identify it as such. We must be able to say, very bluntly, you've taken advantage of this woman. You've taken advantage of her inexperience. You've taken advantage of her emotional vulnerabilities. You've taken advantage of her desire to be closer to God. You've taken advantage of her need for romance and understanding and companionship. And instead of helping her finding a companion that would be an appropriate marital partner who will be her partner for life, you've used her for a period of time and you've discarded her, because these relationships are always, I use you for a period of time and off with you. And this type of afan, this type of what is the word I'm looking for?
Exploitation.
Afan, what is often it's like corruption. Yeah, it can only exist through the silence. People who can call it what it is, people who can say you've taken advantage of someone, when they keep silent and when we get confused because someone starts arguing with us about the technicalities of law and say, well, tell me, why is this not a valid marriage? Well, according to the Shafi'i, Hanafi, Maliki, Hanbali school, all we needed are witnesses, and I did have two witnesses, and then we allow law to numb our moral sense, and that's the problem that I have. Right? Law is there to prevent anarchy. Law is not there to regulate or to define morality. Law cannot do that. But Muslims often approach, they're taught by their teachers, Sharia law is morality. Sharia law is a legal system. It's a legal system, just like any other legal system. It thinks the way lawyers think. It responds to what lawyers usually respond to. Complicated issues of procedure, complicated issues of evidence, legal think has its own culture. But what shuyukh do is come and say, well, Sharia tells you what's right and wrong. And so the minute you start thinking outside the purview of these technical rules, you're silenced. You feel that, oh my God, I'm a bad Muslim. I'm violating God's law. And the savior is the Quran. Go back to the Quran. Is this sifah? Is this al-khudl or ittikhaz al-akhdan? Is this engaging in secretive, exploitative relationships? And if you don't need to be a moral philosopher, if your heart tells you it is, then it is. And it needs to be exposed as such.
Okay, thank you so much. I wanted to turn it over to Marwa with the next question, which I think is perfectly in line with what you've been talking about.
Hi, Professor. My question is on the Islamic directive to conceal the sins of other Muslims being used for community cover-ups. What is the responsibility of the community when we're taught to conceal sins of others?
Yeah, this is, we ought to remember. Okay, so Allah teaches us in the Quran, لا يحب الله الجهر بالسوء من القول إلا من ظلم. So normally, we'd say, what we're told is, or often reminded, a hadith by the Prophet ﷺ, such as, either say فَلْتَقُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لِقَصْمُ, say, speak well of people or just keep silent. But Allah teaches us in the Quran that as-su' min al-qawl, meaning negative talk that is critical, is unacceptable unless it is in response to injustice. Illa man zulim. So, and in fact, if we look at the actual seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, when we find that there were very lively, active discussions about public moral failures of public concern. So when Aisha was accused, everyone knew knew about the incident. Everyone knew who the accusers of Aisha were. Everyone knew when Aisha was vindicated and the accusers were ostracized. People, it wasn't buried underground. And there are many other incidents like this involving a variety of issues. So put it this way. On the one hand, we have these ahadith that say something like, speak well of the dead. The hadith are doctrinal and non-contextual. They don't tell you anything about context, right? But if you study the seerah as a dynamic, lively narrative, you will actually find that Muslims are consistently talking about issues of public concern. And they are naming names, and there are people who die, and then there will be a discussion among Muslims whether they should pray on this person because this person had a reputation as being a hypocrite, right? And, in some situations, the Prophet will say, you pray on him, I will not pray on, or the Prophet, in fact, will say, I will pray on him. And again, we go to this moral issue. A society that does not hold those who commit moral infractions culpable, socially culpable, even I'm not talking about legally culpable, is a society at risk of violating the most basic tenet in the Quran of al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. I mean, how can you do al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar if status will always become an obstacle? So I want to do al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, okay? And someone says, yes, well, do that. But if someone has the status of an imam, they're off limits. If someone has the status of a king, they're off limits. If someone has the status of a minister, they're off limits. If someone has the status of... So what remains of al-amr ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar? Then we're kidding ourselves. We're again allowing instrumental, I'll use this word, didactic thinking, this sort of like mechanical thinking, this way of what does it give me a legal rule, and the legal rule will define everything, rather than moral common sense. Allah commands us to enjoin the good and forbid the evil. Allah tells us that if you can speak critically and even negatively, if it is to address an injustice. Now, in every situation, and again, I don't want us to fool ourselves or lie to ourselves, because honesty is very critical. In all moral challenges, and indeed all legal challenges, you are balancing rights. You have the rights of X, you have the rights of Y, you have the rights of Z, you have the rights of whatever. Okay. So when I put the rights of someone, the reputation, even of a deceased person, and I say, you can't criticize whatever this person has done, regardless of who the victims are. In effect, what I'm saying is the rights of this person trump the rights of contenders. And let's be very honest, okay? Isn't it a fact? Is anyone really going to contest? Is anyone going to challenge me when I say that, lo and behold, time after time after time, when you look at whose rights we say take priority and trump the other, it's often the women get the short end of the stick, right? It's like, well, when all is said and done, we're silencing women and telling women to basically just take it. And Allah will reward you, sister. Be patient. Allah will reward you, sister. Is that a moral situation? Anyone who studied the Quran, is this consistent with what the Quran teaches? I mean, why? I've attended so many talks, and what I can tell you is imams, males, are very adept at using the technicalities of law to obstruct everything and quiet everything and silence everything. Get over. I'm a jurist. I don't. Law is very important, but there is something far more important than law. It's like in legal terms, it's constitutional principles. In Islamic terms, it is the moral foundations of Sharia. The positive law can never be allowed to undermine the moral foundations of Sharia. And the moral foundations of Sharia are not contained in isolated, non-contextual hadith. So for instance, even the hadith, do you know that, and we don't teach this to me, that this hadith that says, only speak well of the dead, it's a weak hadith. It doesn't even have the status of an authentic hadith. But yet it is cited in the Muslim community as if it is a mutawatir. It is just an element of faith that cannot be questioned, cannot be defied. Of course, I'm not, the point is not the point is that if you've suffered an injustice and there is a cause other than simply slandering someone, so there is a morally good objective to be achieved from an exposing an injustice, typically in order to expose those who were complicit in perpetuating an injustice. So, this person has passed away, but there are all these other people who facilitated the commission of the wrong. So why do we need to talk about something in the past? Well, it is to prevent further victims by those who are still around capable of victimizing people. So it is, again, everything goes back to sound morality. We just don't slander people for the sake of slandering them. That's haram. To just, I just want to give them a bad name. No. You ask yourself, what is the moral objective? You have an affirmative duty. I mean, if you've suffered an injustice, you have, Islamically speaking, an affirmative duty to prevent others from falling victim to the same injustice. If for reasons of your own ability, perhaps you're unable to speak out, then you ask Allah to forgive you for being unable to uphold the principle of justice. But notice here what the presumption is. The presumption is that if you suffer the injustice, far from a duty to remain silent, you actually have a duty to speak out. Because if you've suffered an injustice, it's like when if you are walking, you fell in a hole and you got hurt. You come out of the hole and you're sitting and you watch people and you see them fall in the same hole and you don't say anything. Islamically, you've actually incurred the sin by failing to warn. So now, you've suffered an injustice. If you are unable to warn others so that others are not victimized by the same injustice, then actually if you know what's good for you, you have to go plead with Allah to forgive you for your weakness. Because the presumption is actually an obligation to prevent harm. And this is a firm Islamic obligation. And I don't know, how do we get to the point? I really, my heart just bleeds when I find so many young women so confused by these imams about the law. They are actually persuaded by these imams that if they open their mouth and say, I was used, abused, and thrown away, that if they open their mouth and tell anyone, that it's as if the angels are going to curse them and they're going to straight to hellfire. What type of Islam is this, people? I mean, just ask your heart, ask your conscience. Is anyone seriously, was a moral being, willing to say this is our religion? I think you ask, forget all the technicalities. You take a Muslim and you present the issue to them in that way, and they will say, no, this is not our religion. But this is what we've allowed to happen. Let's be honest. This is what we've allowed to happen. And I can understand the vulnerabilities of an inexperienced young woman, especially when, the elements of shame and reputation and, especially if she's done things behind her parents and so on. But if you dare call yourself an imam, your imam, whether man or woman, your moral obligation before Allah is exceedingly heavy. And you are not worth, you do not deserve the status of a scholar, an imam, whatever, if you are complicit in perpetuating these morally offensive situations in our community.
Thank you so much. I want to turn it over to Laura with the next question.
Thank you very much, Sheikh. You have emphasized the obligation of the victim to warn the community, even in the situation where the perpetrator may have passed away. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about what is required of the victim in terms of satisfying that obligation to warn the community and to speak of the injustice. For example, recently we have seen the publication of reports containing anecdotal evidence, compiling testimony from victims on individuals that are leaders in the community as a way to warn others. What do you think about this? Is this the right way that we should be going about these types of things? Is there another preferred way? And how do we reconcile all of this, especially in a culture where the tendency is just to try to keep these incidents sort of under the rug?
The ideal situation is that we get our act together and we actually create arbitral venues for bringing these complaints, investigating these complaints, and publishing reports on these complaints, where the accuser and the accused have an opportunity to appear, present their evidence, and engage. If there is no evidence, the tribunal would direct the procedure of li'an to the parties, where I believe that ultimately, if there's no evidence, that each would take an oath at the risk of Allah cursing them, that what they are testifying to is the truth. And ultimately, this is the Islamic procedure that has been followed for centuries, when their evidence cannot be presented. And so ultimately the tribunal says, will you take an oath that ala kitabillah, on Allah's book, that everything you testify to is truth? And my belief as a Muslim is that if you take an oath like that falsely, you will be doomed on earth before the hereafter. I mean, I've never seen anyone who's taken oath like that and falsely and lead a good life. You know, everything just starts crumbling in their life, and from what I've seen repeatedly. But if we don't have these tribunals, which we don't, and unfortunately, you know, because these tribunals, again, cannot just be staffed by the popular males that we see in all the Islamic conferences giving, because in fact, you know, unfortunately, some of these males are the same ones who are accused of perpetuating some of the offenses. I believe that a victim has a basic right of any victim who has suffered an injustice is to speak. And no one has the right to demand silence from someone who has suffered an injustice, especially a sexual exploitation. So now, of course, you know, you say, well, but isn't this, how about the right of the accused? What the accused has the right to respond to whatever narratives is put out in the venues such as the ones you've described. And I prefer that the accused confronts the victim and says, or the potential victim, and present a trial by oath to that victim. In other words, say, I am willing to take an oath on the Quran that what you said is untrue. Are you willing to take an oath on the Quran that what you said is true? Again, if this oath and it is taken falsely, the consequences upon a human being are extremely grave. But the right of the victim to, or the right of a person to say, to articulate a Muslim, to articulate an injustice. I don't know where in our culture it has seeped in that a Muslim does not have a right to be articulated. I mean, look throughout the Islamic tradition. Ask this question. Are those the leaders of a community? Let's call them Ahl al-Hall wal-Aqd, just the leaders of the community. Are they duty bound to create venues to hear and receive mazalim or not? And the answer that anyone that has any exposure to Islamic history will say, yes, absolutely. Those in any types of positions of authority, authoritative influence, have an obligation to create venues for mazalim to be articulated. Now, what if we don't know who's in charge of a community, or what if those who are in effective moral charge of the community do not create such venues? Does this mean that the mazalim now have to be silenced? Does this mean everyone has to just shut up? It's illogical, right? It doesn't make sense. When you break it down like this, you'd say, no, wait. It is a God-given right that the mazalim be heard. So when a woman says, this happened to me, what she's expressing is a Muslimah. And, you know, are there a certain percentage that where people will be lying and inventing? Yeah, I'm sure there will be a certain percentage. But it is not, but it is a moral imperative we must get ourselves used to the idea that women who complain about violations against their body are normally, not always, but normally saying the truth. And so the price of silencing is too high. The price of avoiding that certain percentage of fraud, of fraudulent testimony by women, is too high, because the price is silencing all these legitimate voices. And that, again, is not a blessed situation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't look at a people that suffer injustice and humiliation and degradation in silence and say, I like it. You know that that's not Allah. All Muslims, I would submit to you in your heart, you know that's not Allah. Allah doesn't say, I like it. Yeah, keep exploiting these women and just do it. As long as you don't contaminate the airwaves, I'm happy. Really? Is that the God we worship? I mean, I often, when I talk to these imams, I say, tell me, I want to know from you, is that the God we worship? Women are half the population. You could not set a moral paradigm where you render half the population vulnerable and expect Allah to be pleased. Again, this is not what the Quran teaches us. And it is not the way that the Prophet looked at how empowered the women of Medina were at the time of the Prophet. Look at the number of times that women come to complain to the Prophet about incidents and naming names. Why do we have so many ahadith in which women go to the Prophet and say, X person did this to me? If the men of today were the men in charge at the time of the Prophet, they'd say, oh, women, don't name names. That's not the seerah. Pay attention to the way that modern day patriarchy, which unfortunately among the most popular imams in our most popular Muslim American institutions, despite the fact that we bring in token women to give talks and so on, patriarchy is extremely high in our institutions. And that's why we negotiate the law in ways that keep reaffirming and strengthening this patriarchy. And I don't think it will be challenged unless women themselves say, enough of the nonsense. We know that our God is about justice and about dignity. And don't cite to me legal technicalities to get me to think that justice is not really important and dignity doesn't really matter in the case of, because it always is in the case of women. I mean, how if an ummah where women don't have, often, this is my belief, is that a good part of why the Muslim ummah crumbled is because women were the vulnerable point. If a woman does not feel her sense of pride, the children she raises are not, she doesn't raise children with karama, with pride and dignity, who stand up as full human beings in society. And so it is the ripple effect of this patriarchy of this is devastating and deeply un-Islamic. And that is what we need to drill within ourselves, that this is not an Islamic thing to hide a crime or hide a moral wrong, to be complicit after the fact by helping to conceal what is wrong is never good. That is not morally acceptable. When someone comes and says, your obligation is to be silent, I say, well, doesn't that make me someone who's complicit in the crime after the fact through silence? Because I'm helping conceal the crime. If you help conceal a crime, you're a part of the crime. What law, what divine will do you think can be? Do you really believe that Allah wills human beings, Muslims, to help conceal crimes? Ask this to your imams. Always cut the BS, cut through the BS, get to the bottom of things, get to the essential moral, bottom line moral point.
Just to follow up, because this is of course so important, but we know that the fact of the matter is that victims of abuse, Muslim or otherwise, are always blamed, and they suffer a lot for coming forward with the truth. It's obviously a lot to ask for them to carry the burden of this, although it's absolutely right. And maybe if we frame it for people that the alternative is that you're complicit by being silent, that this could lead to other people potentially being hurt. It's just, but it's a difficult, obvious battle. What can we do, I guess, to help victims who've already suffered so much not be, re-traumatized and have the bravery to come forward, so so they don't just remain silent. There's so much shame involved.
I want to. There's something else that I learned in my upbringing, and I think it would help us here. In the same way, anytime I or anyone else speak for God's law, there are implied tenets to speaking for God's law. So, for instance, when I say Sharia says, I am talking about, it is implied that I am not talking about what my will, I am talking about God's will. That's implied by the dynamic. It is also implied by the dynamic, as I've emphasized in a lot of my publications, that I am being honest and that I have done my due diligence in discerning and establishing the divine will. And when you hear me talk about the divine will, you in turn have a right to rely on these implied conditions of the dynamic, right? Does everyone agree? Okay. Now, but notice there are implied conditions when someone takes the position of an imam. If you accept, if someone calls you a sheikh and you don't tell them, don't call me a sheikh, I'm not a sheikh. If someone calls you an imam and you in turn don't say, don't call me an imam, I'm not an imam, I'm far from, I'm just a normal human being. Even if you are not called an imam or sheikh or whatever, but you find that people come to you as an authority about religious matters. What is implied within this dynamic You don't even, these are implicit conditions demanded by the very nature of the dynamic itself, is that what your position as a teacher, effectively, you are teaching, instructing, let's say, your position as an instructor is that you are talking about what God desires, what God wants, and that what I am communicating to you has nothing to do with my own subjective pleasures. So, because it's one thing if I tell you, I'm going to answer your question, but your question has nothing to do with what God wants. It has everything to do with what I crave and what I long for. If we're being very honest, right? Now, your response to this to me, it should be, or is likely to be, or I hope it will be, I don't care what you crave or what you want. I care about what God wants. That's not in your interest. Now, when an imam abuses, what is violated is that implicit condition of trust. And part of what we should drill into our community is that, like, in corporate law, we talk about fiduciary duties. Well, an imam's fiduciary duty is a very big deal. And violation of fiduciary duties of imams is a very big deal. These are implied but essential conditions of the dynamic. Once an imam violates their fiduciary duties, you in turn have an obligation to demand that this imam no longer occupy the position that they occupy, because they have violated their implicit duties. Now, having said that, I am, because I've worked in human trafficking, continue teaching, I am very sensitized to the vulnerabilities of victims and the re-traumatization of victims. And لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. Allah doesn't demand from a human being more than they can bear. I cannot come to and demand that the person re-victimize themselves. And I believe that Allah will understand and will forgive. I mean, so you have to ask yourself, on the one hand, I have a moral obligation to expose the fact that this person should not be in a position where people assume that they honor their fiduciary duties, because I've seen that they violate their fiduciary duties. And I have an obligation to say that they are not competent to occupy the position they occupy. But on the other hand, we as a community have an Islamic, an immoral, and an Islamic obligation to create as many venues of help for victims of trauma like this as possible. And that takes money and the building of institutions. I mean, there's just no way around it. And sometimes victims of the conflict need a considerable amount of counseling before they are able to speak up or able to take an affirmative position that would uphold these Islamic principles, which I've described as the fiduciary duties of imams. I know that there are some efforts. Every now and then I hear of someone that creates some type of institution, but I also know that that it's not nearly enough. I mean, and I also know that I'm always surprised. I'm just constantly surprised by how many people have gone through painful experiences, and yeah, I mean, it's the number of people that just speak to you privately. It's very traumatizing. It's just the sheer number of people, and it is always, and I'll tell you, just so the part of the legal problem is that when jurists were thinking about what is necessary for marriage, at that time, the state didn't maintain when necessarily marriage registers. This takes centuries to develop. The idea that the state would keep a register of who's married or not. And often, what lawyers were thinking of is what is necessary to defend against a criminal charge of basically cohabitating with a man or a woman without marriage. So thinking in legal terms, some of them thought, all that's necessary is that you swear that there was an offer and an acceptance and dowry. Khalas. Others thought that, no, what is necessary is that you bring two witnesses that say, I can swear that there was an offer and acceptance and dowry, and so that these people, did what is. And if the witnesses are dead, Joyce went further and said, you bring witnesses who say we can testify that there was a witness who witnessed the marriage. And so what they were often concerned about is to avoid what type of defense people can plead to avoid criminal charges for illegal cohabitation or unlawful cohabitation. But often in traditional societies, it was known who is married and who isn't married. I mean, it would in the same way that till now in the villages in Egypt, it is just, the elders of the society know who's married and who's not married, and that was quite sufficient. Now, this is precisely what is often exploited now, because the law is taken without any of the historical dynamic that resulted in the law or produced the legal discourses. And what normally women are told is, it is not a condition of marriage that we have a wedding. It's not a condition of marriage that we have any type of publicity. It's all that is needed is an offer and acceptance of dowry and maybe witnesses, and voila, and we're done. But any situation that results in dishonoring al-mithaq al-ghaliz, as Allah described marriage as a heavy covenant, and that effectively is an embodiment of the conditions of sibah, the sifah, and khud, basically a secret lover, is problematic. And it's problematic especially if a party emerges out of it deeply bruised and deeply violated and deeply hurt. Here, that's the honest truth about the entire thing. And it's amazing that I never hear anyone just saying it bluntly. That, okay, here is the problem. This is the entire thing. So we need to educate people that, it's not an issue of whether there are going to be two witnesses or no witnesses, or it's an issue of whether your dignity will be upheld in the relationship or not. Whether this is a relationship that is unbecoming of you or becoming of you. And we empower our youth with that concept. Marriage has to be on open terms that see the light of day, nothing secret, nothing hidden, nothing exploitative. And that is what is pleasing to Allah. Anything else is suspect.
Thank you so much. I want to turn it over to Amira for the next question.
Thank you, Sam Sheikh. A lot of Muslim communities often feel pressured to be a model minority, and this makes them reluctant to openly, discuss or admit to any transgressions that occur for fear of feeding into an Islamophobic narrative. So how do we balance our moral obligation and our Islamic obligation to openly address these sorts of instances without feeding into such an Islamophobic narrative?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is a very valid concern, because Islamophobes, the biggest harm from Islamophobes is that they have forced us into defensive positions, where instead of focusing on how we can morally serve our community, we've become engaged in this constant repulsion of assaults, and racism and bigotry. But I want to say this, Islamophobia has had a devastating effect, unfortunately. And it's, again, because we Muslims have failed to respond to it or invest resources in responding to it. But think of how many of our youth end up growing up completely disillusioned or disconnected from Islam, or even leaving Islam altogether because of abuse that they've gone through. And a friend had told me about an Islamic school that apparently was very abusive, and she was telling me that all her friends that came out of that school, all her female friends, none of them were religious. I mean, all of them had just spiraled off, and some of them even had developed all types of problems and so on. And I think that we need to think about that cost. I mean, yes, Islamophobia is, but part of what empowers Islamophobia is our own lack of transparency about the problems within our tradition. So, for instance, Islamophobia will often exploit some of the most misogynistic hadiths. We need to be honest about the misogyny of these hadiths, because it is highly immoral that these hadiths continue to be taught in Islamic schools to our women. So the way you want to respond to Islamophobia is clean house. We ourselves, we don't need to hear, listen here, I'll show you. This is a deeply Islamophobic book. It was published. It's called Sex and Allah. Okay? These 2 volumes, all they are is that they've collected the most misogynistic, disturbing, offensive ahadith and publish them even in Arabic with translation. Here's the Arabic, here's the translation. And it is just, if you haven't been exposed to honest, transparent discourse in Muslim spaces, if you read these 2 volumes, you'll leave Islam. There's no question about it. If you read these 2 volumes, and you have, I can respond to every single point easily that raised in these 2 volumes. But the sad reality is the vast majority of Muslims, 99% of Muslims in the United States, wouldn't be able to respond to what these 2 volumes produce about Abu Bakr and Omar. And even so, I'll give you just a very minor example. قل أعوذ برب الفلق من شر ما خلق ومن شر غاسق إذا وقب ومن شر النفاثات في العقد ومن شر حاسد إذا حسد. This text produces a hadith that tells you that in قل أعوذ برب الفلق من شر غاسق إذا وقب is saying أعوذ بالله, and I'm sorry to be very explicit, that may God protect us from an erect penis. A hadith, I don't want to tell you where the hadith is, that says Allah is teaching us to say, oh, protect us from erect penises. How many Muslims can respond to this? Right? But this is the problem. You want to respond to Islamophobia? Let's choose our teachers. Make sure that they are actually qualified. And get them to speak honestly. Unless you are willing to call misogyny out, you are going to be doomed into the untenable position of trying to interpret away these ahadith just because they're in Bukhari or Muslim or something like that. Bukhari was a human being, and he made mistakes like everyone else. And men, misogynistic men, maybe even having the best intentions, Allahu A'lam, invented a hadith that our Prophet cannot possibly have said. And unless we are willing to come out and be very honest like this, then Islamophobia would continue eating away, because a person who's been violated and been hurt, and then as they're feeling low and demeaned and silenced and muted and all of that, and then they come and they're exposed to, among evangelical groups, they're taught that, because evangelical groups have an intense interest in converting Muslims. I sometimes talk about this in my khutbah. And they have a concept that when you find a Muslim, love on them. And what this consists of is that they, in their own literature that they spread around about converting Muslims, is that Muslims are often don't feel loved or welcomed. They're left wanting in their own spaces. So invite a Muslim into a church, and once a Muslim steps forward in a church, love on them, meaning rush to them with love. Just love, 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 love. Throw at them love, left and right. And you know what? Unfortunately, it works. And it's all made up. Yes, sure. Oh, come over, bake them cakes, bake them cookies, keep loving them, and then tell them, I'm loving you because Jesus loves me. And because Jesus loves me, look at all the love I'm giving you. This is how it is in Christianity. And for these injured Muslims, unfortunately, it works. We have to wake up. This is the real danger of Islamophobia. And the way we respond to it is to be honest and transparent. And here's the thing, God-fearing. Because when Allah looks at us and Allah sees this woman who had become Christian because she found love among Christians, because they loved on her, and Muslims didn't, didn't care even about her hurt. I will be held responsible before Allah in the hereafter. Allah is saying, what have you done about it? How are you, Khaled? How are you responsible? And I don't need to think about your responsibility. I need to think about my responsibility. I mean, it doesn't concern me, oh, what should you have done? My question is, what should I have done? Because that is where my accountability is. And so, yani, yeah, I understand Islamophobia, but we need to clean house. We need to clean house. The amount of women that I've run into that communicate in secret and like, you know, we don't want our name, we don't want anyone to know, we don't want, you know, we don't even want your assistant to be, you know, if we schedule something to not, and they're just extremely traumatized. And I think that how can Allah bless us? You know, how can Allah answer your dua about anything? Allah, please protect my children. Yeah, but have you protected the children of others? What have you done to protect the children of others? Allah, you know, please protect me and you know, make sure that I have a job and have a home. And but what have you done about others? Isn't that our Islam?
Thank you so much. I want to ask this question. How do we address victims of abuse and their shaken faith? How can they find their way back to Islam when their relationship to Islam was so heavily tied and influenced and shaped and created by that relationship with an abuser?
You know, of course, I do my best like everyone else, and I'm not, and you know, only Allah knows if I'm ever successful, and but you know, first thing is the fighting the idea of shame. And I'll tell you, when I was a child and I was in Kuwait, I had an incident where an older man, I was very young, I was maybe, I think 6 or something like that, molested me. And I'm not ashamed to say it because there's no shame on me. And it caused an enormous amount of pain and hurt throughout my life. There is no shame. It doesn't take away from my status. It doesn't take away. I am a law professor. I am a sheikh. I have spent my life studying. Nothing takes away. The shame is on the society and the person who facilitated that. But I tell them that Allah has blessed me with the experience of hurt and pain. Because through that hurt and pain, I learned to grow as a human being beyond myself. And that if you believe in Allah, you believe that Allah sees all, knows all, that justice is Allah's earmark. And to take that pain, not deny it, to embrace it, and to transform it into a means for your empowerment. It cannot destroy you. And the reason if you would have talked to me 30 years ago, I wouldn't be able, I didn't even tell my parents till I was a full-grown man. And the only reason I told my parents is because of certain circumstances that we don't need to get into. But I couldn't even say these words. But I know this is very hard to that pain became my liberation. And so, and I am, so what I told is that when I interact with the violation that you've experienced, the question that is always confronts me is, what are my responsibilities towards your agony and pain? And I am not in the position to preach to you. I'm not in the position to sit here and tell you what you should or should not do. But what I can tell you is, here's my experience and what I've done with that experience. And I don't run away from the pain. I confront it and condemn who you need to condemn. But it will never be the case that among those that need to be condemned is yourself. Because there are, even if you've made wrong decisions, you never gave license to be abused. Even if you've made wrong decisions, this did not include a license to be lied to be cheated, to be tricked, to be abused. Learn from these experiences. And that's the only thing I can offer. And then other than that is, of course, to do the best I can to direct that person towards professional help if it's available. I mean, through experience, I've had some painful experiences with some non-Muslim healthcare providers. So if I can find a Muslim, I always prefer that. But you do what you can.
Thank you so much. I think that your words were so penetrating and, so empowering. And so much of, what we talk about at the Usuli Institute, through the Holocaust, and what we learned through your khutbahs is always so inspiring and empowering. I mean, you give people the tools to know really how to address a difficult situation with honesty and transparency and bravery. And I think that just in itself is so valuable and so beautiful. And so thank you for, sharing that with all of us. I think one of the most important lessons when people follow Usuli or even listen to the khutbahs and they see, okay, here's the difference between a scholar who you feel in your heart, like you're speaking truth, you're giving us a way forward. And it's empowering because to know that there are still scholars that we can trust despite this, climate where we hear more and more about people, who don't act in a trustworthy way. So thank you so much. This means so much. And with that, actually, I would like to turn it over to Cheyenne to ask an important question.
Thank you. Sheikh, as you know, a lot of Muslims strengthen their Islam and come to understand Islam through public speakers or through scholars' work. This develops an affinity towards that particular scholar and their relationship with God and the relationship with their religion is very much influenced by this particular person. And their whole world can come crashing down when it comes out about a particular individual's immorality or abusive behavior. What should we make of such scholarship? Obviously, it must have had some level of value that it was able to bring somebody close to God. What do we make of this, in hindsight? Should we never again listen to the lectures? Should we discount the previous work that they've done? How do we deal with this? How do we reconcile this in our minds? And do we add caveats to people that, look, I'm glad that you're spreading something nice, a nice clip, but you also have to remember that this individual unfortunately committed an extreme immorality and hurt a lot of people.
Yeah, this is a tough question. It is really important to remember that. I mean, it's stating the obvious, but really, we are human beings. We are human beings, and look at how often Allah Subhanahu wa Taala emphasizes the role of Shaitaan in the Quran. I mean, if you listen to Allah's word, Allah warns us that Shaitaan is no easy foe. I mean, one a scholar who some of you heard me talk about, who I highly respect, and who's unfortunately in prison in Saudi Arabia today, Hassan Farhan al-Malki, an amazing scholar. He makes the point that in the hadith tradition, and I don't discount hadith at all. I'm not one of those people who rejects hadith. I mean, no, but in the hadith tradition, often the shaitan is portrayed as an insignificant figure. But in the Quran, the Allah warns us time and time again that shaitan is an ever-present foe. And the reason I'm saying this is that shaitan is very strong. And that scholars or no scholars, we are human beings. And we fail, and we weaken, and we commit sins. And what is far more shameful about a sin than the sin is the failure to repent from the sin. So, we know examples of a scholar that it comes out had committed a kabira, a major sin, and a scholar who has had a lot of influence. And it's really if someone takes the position that, okay, I now, because of this moral failure, I now will not read anything by this scholar, I respect that. But I also respect someone who says, as long as I know in my heart that this scholar has sincerely repented, I accept that from them. In other words, I can never discount the moral value of tawbah. That's one. The other thing, as to what you take from them, it depends. I mean, it really depends, because ideas, once you commit something to paper, and I really believe, and those of you who have read my book, Conference of the Books, wouldn't be surprised by this statement. Once a book is born, a book is alive, independent of the person who gave birth to the book. This book is a living entity. It doesn't matter who wrote it. Khalas, who wrote it gave birth to it, and now that baby is now its own thing. And I don't even, what that book could mean to me could be something, ideas and thoughts that the author, who gave birth to the book never thought of. That's the value of the book. And so, you know, if I look at the ideas, the structure of the ideas, the soundness of the ideas themselves, and I put aside the fact that the author didn't live up to the ideas, if I find the ideas rationally compelling for me. So the role of, you know, someone who doesn't want to accept their tawbah, I respect that. But someone who wants to accept their tawbah, I also respect that. But when it comes to dealing with ideas, I would plead with people to think of especially scholarly production as its own living entity once it is born. And if it spoke to you, continue this relationship. And in many ways, think of the book as is disappointed in the author in the same way that you're disappointed in the author. And perhaps even the book divorced the author in the same way that you've divorced the author. There are books that have divorced their authors. You know, we have books where the author writes a book and then 20 years later changes everything and no longer believes in what they've written, but the book continues being very influential because the author is khalas. I mean, they're a separate entity. So I know that, but we often, you know, a part of, I don't like the culture of superstars, and we unfortunately have gained. I noticed this among Muslims in the West, and you know, I'm a very frank person, and I've noticed that there is a tendency in the Muslim community in the West. I used to joke with my students about this. Back home, in order for someone to be looked at as a respectable sheikh, they had to be what you admired as a respectable sheikh is the more unattractive they are, the more respected they are. You know, the more not superstar quality they are. So, you know, they're bookish, they're like bookworms, they're not good looking, and then it's like, oh, you know, mashallah, this is someone. But I've noticed among Muslims in the West is this phenomena of a convert or white or someone who passes as white, you know, and that superstar, imam superstar phenomena, rock star phenomena. I don't know. I find that troubling, and the reason I'm mentioning that is that we don't do imams a favor when we make them feel that they're attractive, because we are helping Shaitaan victimize them. It's not healthy for an imam to feel that they attract the opposite sex. It's not healthy. It's helping Shaitaan. And yeah, don't help Shaitaan against your imams. So, you know, I just wanted to throw that out there. Like, so, I mean, I'm not impressed by. I know that imams think like, oh, we need to look like we are approachable to the youth and so on, but Shaitan is very powerful, and Shaitan can trick all types of people, and there is a reason that this old wisdom has, you know, has created a certain type of aura to what counts as a proper imam. And and being a rock star is not one of them. Let's leave it at that.
Just a couple of follow-up questions to what you said. What about if a person's moral transgressions could have influenced their viewpoints or their writings? And what about if you promote work from someone like that, that could potentially be seen as a validation of that person?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, this is because the question that Cheyenne was asking is if you were already influenced by someone and then you discover that this someone has committed a kabira, had a major moral failure, do you divorce the ideas and divorce the text and divorce the book? Now, but the situation I think that you're raising is from a different angle, and if the person has spoken about marriage, for instance, and what is required in a marital relationship, but what the sin that is committed is related to the doctrines that they espouse. If you can discern, if you look at these doctrines and you can discern ways that sin might have influenced their point of view, use your critical reason to think through and ask yourself, is this doctrine, is it possible for this doctrine to be skewed in a certain way because this person wanted to justify their, so for instance, there are some Muslims, unfortunately, who want to consume alcohol. And so they end up talking about Islamic law, deconstructing Islamic law. And when you look at their sin and you look at what they espouse, you can see the nexus between the two. This is a different situation, because in that situation, you have every right to say, you are not a trustworthy source, because I can see the way that your motives might have influenced you doctrinally. When it comes to promoting, though, the influence of a person like that, you have an affirmative obligation. You can, and I'm hesitant to name names, but you can recommend, and there are certain books that have been written by people who have fallen from grace. You can recommend a book with the caveat that I tell someone, I think this is a good book that talks about Islam and democracy, for instance, or that talks about the basic foundations of Islam. Keep in mind that this author has done X, Y, and Z, but I don't think that what this author has done has anything to do with the worth of the scholarship in this text. And I do that. I mean, I don't believe that if I can't see any way that the sin has influenced the material doctrinally, I don't exclude the material just because, of course, but if I can see an influence, then yeah, I exclude the material. I don't accept, and here I'm talking about scholarship specifically, but if I hear of an imam, for instance, who turned out to be a hypocrite, will I and I'm actually very strict about this. Will I go pray behind them? No, I won't. Someone who has proven themselves as a hypocrite, I don't believe that praying jama'ah behind them is valid. So I don't pray behind them. Will I go sit and listen to the khutbah? Absolutely not. And note, a hypocrite, there are all types of sins. So there is currently the sin they committed is that they sold out to dictators. I will not attend their lectures and I will not pray behind them. Their old lectures before they sold out, I still listen to and I still learn a great deal from. But khalas, the trust has been breached. I don't trust that they will respect their fiduciary duty. They have proven themselves as untrustworthy persons when it comes to guiding to people, people placing their trust in them. This is very separate from the production of past scholarship. And that's a different matter. No, they should not be continue to command and lead, especially when there is a lack of full disclosure and complete repentance. It's one thing if someone comes and says, okay, people, I'm going to admit everything I've done wrong. Please, please forgive me. Forgive me. I've done everything. Here is full accounting of everything I've done wrong. I repent, and then, they've proven themselves a truly repentant. That's a different situation, perhaps. But someone who doesn't even disclose what they've done wrong, doesn't admit anything, because that's a situation we often confront, right? Someone who continues to obfuscate the issues and continue to victimize the victimized. How? Then in what ways can we continue to say, oh, let's just turn a new page and keep going? No, it doesn't work that way.
Okay, thank you. So we have crossed the 6 o'clock finishing point, but we knew that this could happen. And so we're very close to the end of our list of questions. So I think we can safely close up in just a little bit if everyone could just hang on a little bit longer. So I'm going to turn it over to Rami for the next question.
Thank you, Sheikh. My question is on the etiquette between teachers and students, and particularly male teachers with female students. What are ways that we can ensure that women feel welcome to learning environments, but still feel protected and safe?
Okay, that's a good question. I don't believe. I don't believe in our day and age that partitions are a valid way of, creating artificial environments in Islamic spaces is not a healthy way to go. And so what we are specifically targeting is the type of dynamics that allow abuse to take place. And abuse, the elements that eventually result in abuse. I mean, abuse normally doesn't just occur in a split second. Normally, there are preparatory acts. There are things that eventually lead to the abuse. And the key to it, to put it quite bluntly, is is being lax with khalwa, being lax with the teacher existing with the female students alone. So taking real life examples, any imam that tells you come to my home, and then you discover that you're going to be meeting in a closed space, even if their wife is at home and they meet you in a room and close the door. It's unjustified. It is not proper. Any imam that tells you, oh, you're so brilliant and wonderful, I want to, I see a lot of potential in you, let's meet in some private space, or in a space outside the view of the community. It's improper. I mean, you think I'm brilliant and talented? Tell me in front of everyone. Encourage me in front of everyone. Don't take me to the side. There's no reason for that. And remember, I mean, it is rare that we see. I've never heard the situation of an imam saying in front of everyone, in front of the congregation, "Will you please marry me secretly and let's not tell my wife?" You need privity for the abuse to happen, seclusion. And I think Shaitaan comes when we cave in and say, it's okay, no harm with this one. Resist that. There is, or, there is, if a woman grabs my hand and kisses it, I don't freak out and start insulting her, but there is no reason for that to happen. It's just, okay, if it happens and you should be polite and just try, if you can't grab your hand away in time, but khalas. But there, we know intuitively what type of situations leads to what is wrong, and we should be vigilant about that. And again, I am not. An imam can come and say, let me cite to you this authority and that authority about why there's nothing wrong with you and me meeting away from everyone's eyes where no one can see us. Yeah, they can cite whatever they cite, but what does your heart tell you? Allah has given you your own internal divine revelation called the conscience of Damir. And it doesn't matter what a scholar has said is the limits of permissibility. A scholar that you've never met, who's lived God knows when, you will never meet, it doesn't matter. Your heart can tell you what space Shaitaan can grow in. And if it's a space for Shaitaan to grow in, then just decline. Say no.
Thank you so much. So I think we have just a question to close, and I'll ask this. If we become aware of or suspect abuse, what should we do? What is our moral and legal responsibility? And I suppose that is a question as individuals, also as a community. How do we create a space for the victim? How do we establish chains of accountability in our organizations? So, in terms of last thoughts as we close up.
Abby, okay, there are situations where the victim is truly helpless. So I think of, and again, sometimes the mihna is a ni'mah. Mihna is a ni'mah. So I think of what I experienced in my life. And I think of, as a child, of what I experienced, the idea that another child would experience what I've experienced is beyond endurance. Now, as what would I have thought are the duties of any adult that could have possibly known what this guy does or is capable of doing? What would I have thought are his obligations? Because that answers the question. If you are in a situation where the victim is helpless, i.e., a child that, or in any equivalent, truly situation of vulnerability, then listen, don't kid yourself. Your obligation is absolute. You have to stop it. You have to stop it either by exposure or going to the authorities, or, because if you are aware and you could do something and you fail to do something, then you are with partly, or you share in the blame of the trauma that is inflicted on truly vulnerable victims stays for life. It is something that it's an injury that you never truly heal from. There's no healing from that. Truly, I mean, it gets better. You know, whatever. But so then think of that, the scale of that responsibility. Now, there are other situations where the victim is not truly vulnerable. In other words, the victim might be deluded, might be lied to, might be deceived, and your first obligation is to speak to the victim and to try to convince them to claim their own agency and to change their own. Now, if I see a pattern of abuse and I get to the point where I just think, this continues and no one will speaking up, I might get to the point where I think, okay, I'm going to have to do it. It's just that, so for instance, if I notice that, because this is actually in real life, an imam who has made it his sunnah to, every time there's a convert, he marries her for a number of years and then divorces her. And, and I look at, and I know that this imam has married 12 converts and, put them in situations where often, like, marry them, take them to a foreign country, leave them in a foreign, just horrible. And I go and I warn these converts, I say, don't marry this imam. And they don't listen to me. I could get, and I do get to a point where I say, okay, I'm going to have to expose it to the entire community. Because this imam somehow is telling these converts that by marrying me, I'm going to teach you your deen. I am such a blessed person. Look at me. I have this certificate from Azhar. I have this connection with, I don't know who, a bunch of shiyukh that shows them pictures of him with this sheikh and that sheikh and this. But then this is whether even these women consent, but it is a situation that abuses Allah's law and Allah's morality. And I get to the point where, with all due respect to the agency of these women, I have to speak out. Um, do you know that I just want people to know part of the problem. Like, for instance, there was a famous Sufi / Salafi group, the followers of Hamim Keller in Jordan. You look at this community, marriage and divorce, they marry and divorce like all the time. And you know where this comes from? Is that these people tell converts and tell young Muslims, look at how easily the Sahaba would marry and divorce. They would, and someone like Al-Mughira bin Shu'bah married and divorced 80 times. And in addition to that, you find in some Islamic sources that they list this among Fada'il al-Mughira bin Shu'bah. Among his moral good qualities is that he blessed 80 women with marriage and divorce, as if marrying him. And I know in a real life situation, an Imam comes and says, look, the Mughira was a Sahabi. He found, because of his piety, that it was incumbent on him to bless 80 women with marriage. And look, I am an equally blessed human being. This guy claimed that he's memorized the Quran, and he's, Sheikh this and Sheikh that and all of that. And so I want you to know, having my seed in your body is a blessing. This is a barakah. Don't you want that barakah? The angels will surround you. And these poor women who were either very young or old converts buy into it. We have to be honest about our tradition. Even if it's historical reality, even if it is historical reality, we have to condemn as unacceptable what Al-Mughira bin Shu'bah did. No, it's not. He didn't bless women, 80 women. He abused 80 women. We can't wait for an Islamophobe to put it in their writing and our kids to read it and say, oh my God, what an awful revision. It wasn't Islamic, people. And the reason the Sahaba married and divorced so easily is because in their culture, life expectancy was limited. The nature of marriage was a family was a family. Families married, not individuals. And families were often completely involved in the decision of, okay, now you need to have a partnership with this person or not have a partnership with this person. Our situation is very different. Our morality is anchored in the Quran. The Quran tells us it transcends time periods and histories. What does it say about marriage? It says mithaq ghaliz. It is a truly heavy covenant. What does the Prophet ﷺ tell us about divorce? It is hated by God. It is halal, but it is hated by God. So you can't take the matter lightly. Don't allow people to come, because this is what imams who are abusive are very competent at. They know how to go and take little examples from history. I know of an imam, again, oh, listen, the Prophet, ﷺ, Sauda, came to him and said, don't divorce me, just, I give up my rights I give up my rights as a wife, but just keep me in. So you, in turn, should just stop complaining. Be like Sauda, be like the Prophet, the wife of the Prophet. Even if it is historic, and I have very serious doubts about the authenticity of this tradition. I don't believe it even happened. But even if it did happen, you're comparing the example of Sauda being married to the Prophet ﷺ to I don't care what Imam, regardless of who you are. You're not the Prophet. You don't even come close to the Prophet. There's nothing, I don't care what your knowledge is, there's nothing that is blessed. Allah didn't give you a Quran. So these basic elements, we have to be honest about our tradition. We have to speak honestly. Events like this have to be the norm. You have to demand, you bring someone to talk about Islam, either they speak with honesty and transparency or you kick them out. If you're going to come and give us platitudes and demagoguery and just a bunch of slogans, get out. We don't want to listen to you. We don't have time for you. You want to come and talk truth like Allah demands us to do, like Allah expects us to do? Ahlan wa sahlan. You're welcome. That is what I want, people. That's what we need. Because otherwise, it will continue. Those who go and they get a chaplaincy program or whatever, they learn enough examples that they can cite and confuse the minds of these poor women who they then exploit, and we keep going like that.
Alhamdulillah, thank you so much. I think that last point truly underscores the importance of what we've been doing at the Usuli Institute with Project Illumine, which is going back to the foundations, understanding the moral message of the Quran, and in a truly enlightened way. If you've been watching this and you enjoy, or if you feel the truth of what you've been hearing and from Sheikh Abou El Fadl, alhamdulillah, this is exactly the passion and the insight and the depth that we deep dive into every chapter of the Quran and really understand certainly the historical context, what the meaning is that the Prophet received, what was happening with early Muslims at the time that the revelation came, eliciting the moral principle, the moral message, the moral trajectory, and then trying to apply that to our modern day. And it's a nuanced, complicated, sophisticated engagement, but that's exactly what is required, what God demands, and what we as complex human beings deserve. So if it's an incredible learning. And here is a perfect example of the difference when you have that depth of knowledge and how it can make a difference in one's life. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, about the tafsir, is just even if you cannot attend the halaqas, even if you cannot, just make it a point in your life to listen to the recordings, even if you listen to 10 minutes a day. We all need the Quran to come alive in our life. We all need to listen to Allah's revelation as if it is being revealed right now in our day, and we're hearing it right now. So just make a commitment, even if it's 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day before you go to bed, when you wake up, to make a lifelong commitment. Okay, I want to know the Quran. I want to know what Allah is telling me in this book, and how is it relevant to my life. So it's not, we're not. The expectation is not that you wake up tomorrow and you completely turn your life upside down. The commitment will bring barakah and blessings in your life. That's what I want to say.
Absolutely. And also, Dr. Abou El Fadl is standing on the pulpit giving a powerhouse virtual khutbah every single Friday. And if nothing else, this is applied Quranic Islam into our world. So you learn something new, tons of things new, but what's happening in the world, you hear things you won't hear anywhere else. It's almost like an independent media channel, but you also get the overlay of the Quranic principles, morals. How should we as ethical Muslims feel and react and think about the world, and engage with the world? So if nothing else, if you have time for nothing else, just watch that weekly khutbah for an incredible education. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, everyone who asked the questions and participated. But most of all, thank you, Dr. Abou El Fadl, for this absolutely incredible session. I think it exceeded everyone's expectations. We covered issues that were so pertinent to the challenges that we face in our world. I think people came away with, insight, tools, vantage point, a new perspective, and hopefully empowerment to tackle these issues with more certainty. Go for it.
I just want to say I don't know, I never know who's listening to me, but any women out there, if you find yourself in a situation and you want to reach out, write me either through Usuli or through my law school email address, and you want to talk to me about your situation. As long as Allah keeps me alive on this earth, I am here for you. I will happily talk to you. And in the past, it has been a while since I've sued, but I was the first, because of such an abusive situation, the first Muslim to sue a prominent Muslim because of such a situation, and I've done it since then. It's been a while. I've grown old and don't have time for these lawsuits. But my point is, the fact that someone claims to be Muslim and does wrong angers me. It actually makes me more vigilant about holding them responsible. And if I think that you need legal help, I'll do my best to put you in contact with those who can help you legally. So I just want to put it out there.
Okay. Thank you again so much, everyone. If you want more information about who we are and what we do, definitely visit our website at usuli.org. We're also on social media. If you search up Usuli Institute, we have some really cool things happening during Ramadan. We have a Ramadan matching program for anyone who wants to support our work. This tafsir that we've been working on, we are actually working to turn it into a publication, an actual multi-volume book, which will take a lot of time and effort and smart people. It requires funding. Anyone who is part of that project, I believe, enters a special group that is supporting God's magnificent book. I truly believe that God will bless anyone who's part of this project. And all of our events right now are free online on our Usuli YouTube channel. And we have a wonderful sale in coordination or conjunction with our publisher for several of Dr. Abou El Fadl's really tremendous books at Roman.com. Roman and Littlefield is a 30% off sale. And if you want to know more about Usuli methodology or Dr. Abou El Fadl's scholarship, it's a perfect time to purchase The Search for Beauty in Islam, Reasoning with God, and God Knows the Soldiers, which are really classics and really life changers. And we have a weekly email if you want to keep in touch. So just go to our website and subscribe, and then you'll get an email every Friday so you know what's happening with us. Again, thank you so much. I am blown away by how wonderful this exchange was, how valuable, and thank you for being with us. And hopefully we will see you online sometime soon, inshallah. Friday for the khutbah, Saturdays for halakas, and inshallah other special events coming up. So thank you so much. Wishing you all a blessed Ramadan very soon. And thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.